Dodcast. I'm Luke Dodson, and my guest today is Anthony Peake. Sure. So yeah, you were saying about the your own experiences of the pandemic and the sort of the idea of maybe a daemonic premonition or indication.
Yeah, the idea has always fascinated me. The idea that if we're all living our lives again, it is evident that we would have some kind of inkling or some kind of idea that this has happened. You know, again, citing your grandfather's wonderful work, I Have Been Here Before, as a classic example. You know, you have the central character there, Gertler, who's aware of something that really is going to be terrible, is going to happen to two of the characters. So he is able, because of his pre-knowledge, to avert the disaster. Now, if it is the case that, as my cheating the ferryman hypothesis proposes, that we are in this kind of scenario, and many of us, particularly those of us who experience deja vu, are in fact living our lives again in some form of Groundhog Day scenario, we will have all lived through this before. Now, the question I had to ask myself was, well, if this was the case, why have we had no pre-warnings, no inklings, because we were all naively happy 6 months ago, being blissfully unaware that the whole world was going to go into lockdown? And I believe the reason is quite a simple one. And because COVID is unique in the sense that it is worldwide, so there's nowhere anybody can escape from the impact of COVID. So my daemon could manipulate a scenario whereby I could go and live in America, or I could go and run off to the south of Spain or somewhere. But even if I did that, it wouldn't make any difference. I would still be affected, and my life would still be affected. And I suspect this is because our collective daemons know that this is going to be a powerful change within the way we think, the way the world works, the way in which society functions. And I suspect that our daemons are wanting this, not necessarily wanting this to happen, but realize there's nothing they can do. So therefore, there's no evasive actions that can be taken. Again, we could use the analogy of a third-person computer game, whereby there's an incident in the game that whatever you do, you can't get around it. So therefore, you as the game player, i.e. the daemon, when you play that game, you know that it is inevitable and there's nothing you can do. So there's no way that you can manipulate the behavior of your on-screen sprite to avoid that. And I think that's what's probably happening now. And I think what it's doing is it's making us be much more sensitive to issues we've never been sensitive to before. While we've been in lockdown, an awful lot of us have been able to think a little bit more about what we're doing with our lives, why we're doing it, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of how I can change things myself in one way or another? And I think this will be possibly the inevitable outcome of it, or maybe not. I really genuinely don't know, but the whole thing intrigues me at the moment as to the way it's building up and whether there's going to be a second wave, how much we can believe in terms of whether the statistics are being manipulated or not. And I genuinely, for once, I really do not know. This is the thing, but I know people who have died. One of my Facebook friends, his wife died in her early 40s of it with no underlying disease, with no underlying illnesses whatsoever, and she died. And literally today, I've had a message from another of my Facebook friends who's just been rushed to hospital, and he's got it. Mm-hmm. And he has no underlying illnesses either. So it is obviously very real. But the question is, what is it exactly? And of course, as you know, you pointed out in a recent email to me, you know, what is the role, if it's a virus, what is the role of viruses here? And makes us think a little bit more about how curious the whole thing is. For instance, as a final point before you come to your next question, I'd like to make the observation that viruses generally, as they evolve, it is counterproductive for the virus, for the host being, animal, system, organism, or whatever, to die, because when the host organism dies, so does the virus. So the virus itself has vested interests in being in a position that the host organism can survive in one way or another, whereas it seems that this doesn't work that way. You know, it doesn't. It seems to be going out of its way to kill the host organism, which makes no sense.
Well, it is a very, very strange and uncertain time, and this virus has all kinds of qualities that you know, virologists and immunologists are really scratching their heads over. And I suppose there was one particular relevant point from your recent book that I wanted to get onto, but before that, I thought it'd be interesting as well to mention about Priestley's comment on the First World War, which is quite similar to what you're saying about the COVID situation being just so all-encompassing that our, assuming we have a sort of precognitive awareness, which I feel as you do, our listeners will, that it's too all-encompassing for any kind of forewarning to really take place. Having said that, within the context of the First World War, we did have the odd premonition, albeit a symbolic one, in the case of Carl Jung's dream of Europe being drenched in blood. And I wish I could say I had something equivalently dramatic or interesting, but I have to say that it wasn't quite that. It was just that I ended up buying a load of books on apocalyptic scenarios and survivalism just before this whole situation started. So it's kind of a growing interest in the sort of the possibly quite rickety future of our society.
Yeah.
Kind of happened to coincide. One really weird was I was reading a book called The Long Emergency by a guy called James Howard Kunstler, and it's a very, very persuasive account of our kind of future with climate fluctuations and resource depletion and stuff like that. Has a whole chapter on coronaviruses. This came out 15 years ago.
Wow.
He was saying, there's going to be, will most likely be a sort of SARS type pandemic coming out of probably somewhere in China in the next 10, 15 years. And obviously they've been predicting this for quite a long. But the timing was very strange. It was like just at this point, and I had this feeling around that time. I just had this sort of strange kind of one of my periodic nervous breakdowns, basically. I was just like, what am I doing? What's happening? What am I doing in my life? Just going into work, just being like, what is this? And so there was. I did have it wasn't exactly that I felt like something was happening, but there's some odd synchronicities there did take place. But I really wanted to ask you about, there's a really fascinating bit from your latest book, The Hidden Universe, which is a cracking read, and everyone should buy it. And you mentioned that I quoted it in my recent email, and you mentioned, I can't find the quote straight off, but basically to the effect of the quantum observer effect has been observed on actually much larger entities than just subatomic particles. And in fact, entities that are as big as, if I remember correctly, sort of 800 atoms.
Definitely 60, and I think recently they pushed it out to 800. I know that the last time I really checked it was Buckminster fullerene, which has 60 atoms in it. But subsequently, I know that much larger atoms, and not only this, but atoms that are not spheroid as well, which is interesting because, of course, Buckminster fullerene is a kind of a lattice sphere. Whereas there are other substances now that are kind of flat and really squidgy shaped, and this is intriguing. But I had heard that recently they'd got even larger, and they're en route now to being a similar size to viruses. So this begs some certain questions as to what point it is that quantum weirdness becomes Newtonian certainty, and that size level is increasing all the time. Now, recently I saw an article saying that in terms of the behaviors of subatomic particles and quantum effects are now being seen at a much larger level. In fact, there was an article that was written only a few weeks ago about this, and it's to do with, I think, probably indirectly the Casimir effect, but also, again, the idea that subatomic effects can come through into our greater reality, because we know, for instance, with things like Bose-Einstein condensates, which are groups of atoms that work together in a particular way, and they work as a field almost. These can be seen. You know, you can actually observe with a microscope the effects of Bose-Einstein condensates, and a classic Bose-Einstein condensate is a laser. You know, so clearly the quantum effects. So there is this argument used all the time that quantum effects shouldn't worry us and shouldn't bother us because they affect things that are so tiny. But the question has to be asked that if molecules show wave-particle duality, if molecules show, in effect, the role of the observer in changing that molecule from a wave, that is a wave that is spread out in space and time, into a point particle, these are the things, these are the building blocks of the reality we see around us. In other words, everything we see is either existing within a field, or it's a carrier of the information, a boson, like a photon, or it is a solid point particle. Now, if that is the case, aggregates of these things, if I have a pile of marbles, the overall thing I see might be something containing 20,000 marbles, which I see, but it is made up of all the individual marbles within that. And it's the same with atoms and molecules. If I look at water, water is just made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Each the molecules are just made up of that. There is nothing else there. But if there is something curiously strange about the hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atoms, that means that collectively, why is it that when they come collectively together, the observer effect seems to disappear? And I argue it's because in a much deeper level of reality, we have a direct relationship with the external reality we perceive. And this is something I'm working on now, which I'm working with the idea of what I'm going to call it. But at the moment, I'm playing with the idea of the cosmic anthropic egregorial principle. This is the first time I've mentioned this in an interview, by the way, so you have an exclusive here. And in this, I'm arguing, I don't know if you come across the cosmic anthropic principle at all.
Yes, I have. And it is it's the observation that the universe is so finely tuned for life and intelligent life, particularly, that it appears as though the universe was sort of almost created for that purpose, if you want to use those terms. But there's other parallel universe theory has been used to explain it, that there could be infinite numbers of universes, some of which don't have this. And
yes, absolutely spot on. It was originally put forward, I think it was by John Wheeler and Frank Tipler. I have the book somewhere in here. And it's a fascinating idea because effectively it means that the present universe that we exist within got everything right first time in order for consciousness to evolve. Now, this is from the very first moments of the Big Bang, when the relationship and the percentage of matter, or whatever it was at that early stage, plasma, whatever we want to call it, was made up of antimatter and matter. Had they been equal, the universe would never have even started. It wouldn't have even begun. So there was a slight preponderance of matter to antimatter, which allowed the universe to then start to progress. And then there are a whole series of incredibly fine-tuned incidents that took place as the universe was evolving. These are fine-tunings. We're talking tiny percentage points that, had they been different, life would not have evolved. And then you extrapolate from that to the things that we observe even now within the environment on this planet. I always love the example of water. Again, it's interesting that I used H2O before, but water is really intriguing. As far as I know, it is and I can stand corrected on this, but it's, as far as I know, the only liquid that freezes from the top downwards. Okay, all other liquids freeze from the bottom upwards. Now, that may not seem to be profoundly important, but when you're dealing with the kind of life forms that evolved on Earth. If water did what other liquids do, the general state of water on the planet would be frozen, wouldn't it? Because because the lower down you are, the colder it is within the oceans, which means they'd freeze from the bottom upwards. And they would never unfreeze. They'd be in a state of permafrost, or a state of frozen with only a thin veneer at the top in the summer that would be liquid water, which would mean again that life could not have evolved the way it did. And that's one of the examples, but it's one of many. Now, the only alternative, and there is only two alternatives to this, either the universe evolved fine-tuned to allow you and I to be having this conversation, or Hugh Everett III's 1957 hypothesis of the many worlds interpretation, i.e. there are trillions of universes and we happen to just live in one of, I don't know, a few billion that are fine-tuned to allow consciousness to evolve. And I'm reminded here of a very dismissive, a writer I normally really, really love, Douglas Adams. But in one of his novels, he ridicules the cosmic anthropic principle. And he uses this wonderful analogy of a puddle. And there's this puddle and it's lying there and it says, isn't it absolutely amazing that this depression that I'm in is exactly the right size for me? Because of course, if you're looking at it from the point of view of a puddle, you think, isn't it amazing? You know, I'm just in this thing that is perfect for me. And then the sun comes out and it evaporates. Now, that's a very amusing idea. But of course, it doesn't work for the cosmic anthropic principle because that's just an analysis of a puddle. It's not the same. So there's only one of the two the two issues, and both of those support in different ways my overall hypothesis anyway. So I don't care whether we want to go to the many worlds hypothesis or the quantum anthropic or the cosmic anthropic principle. But let's argue, for argument's sake, that this universe, this enclosed universe, is the only universe that's ever been. If that is the case, then it means that there's probably a direct relationship between consciousness and the external universe itself. It's as if the universe itself was hardwired in order to bring into existence entities that can collapse the wave function of its own physicality. Now, again, just to go back to this, just so people can understand the fine point I'm trying to make here. A subatomic particle, until it is measured, all subatomic particles, and they're still there until they're measured, from photons to electrons to neutrons to protons, they all, before they are measured, exist in what's called a statistical wave function. Now, the statistical wave function is not like a wave in water. It's more like a crime wave. It's a mathematical function. And Max Born, I think in 1924 or 1925, who interestingly enough was Olivia Newton-John's great-grandfather. So rather like yourself, Olivia Newton-John has a famous forebearer, but there's an aside there. And Max Born came up with this equation, which came in line with Schrodinger's equation, which came up at the similar time, which was how wave functions work. And he argued that what is really happening here is the wave function is a statistical wave function. And when it is measured, the wave function collapses from a statistical chance that an observed a particle can be anywhere in the universe. It reduces that statistical function down to the probability of it being found in one location or another. So before it's observed, it's smeared out as a wave function. When it's measured, it decides to be in one place or another. But, and this is profoundly important, it can actually exist and be collapsed into anywhere in the universe. And this is a fact how the sun works. There's some very interesting work about how the sun works using exactly the same principle, that subatomic particles can exist in one place or another, and they can statistically be anywhere. Now, this is the idea of what's called quantum tunneling. And quantum tunneling is how the sun works. It's how the sun functions. Because inside the sun, everything they're just ions. They're ions of hydrogen. I think it's hydrogen converting to helium or helium converting to hydrogen. I think it's hydrogen converting to helium. But the problem is, if they are just single ions, which a hydrogen nucleus is, it's only ever positive. So for it to get close together, to have fusion, to actually bring together the energy levels, there has to be something peculiar happening. And this is to do with the way quantum particles work. Now, this has been observed in something called the twin slit experiment. And every time they do the twin slit experiment, something very peculiar takes place. What you do is you fire a stream of photons or a stream of particles, whatever we like, through two slits, one particle at a time. The mystery is that if the particles are not observed going through singularly, what happens is the other side of the twin slits, you see what's called an interference pattern, which shows that they're waves. Okay, but when single particles are going through, a single particle, you know, are firing a whole series of single particles, one after the other. Logically, each single particle can only go through one slit or the other. If there's two slits, they can only go through one or the other. And the question is, if they only go through one or the other, how can an interference pattern take place where it's suggesting that the particles, when they go through singly, are interfering with themselves, to coin a phrase, to bring about the interference pattern the other side? So what the scientists did, and they still do, is they put a measuring device on one of the slits or the other to decide, to see which slit the particle goes through. Get this, every time they do this, the interference pattern immediately disappears, and you see the effect if single particles were coming through. Now, let's think about this for a second. It means that the particles know that a measuring device has been placed between one slit or the other, and they change their behavior dependent upon whether they are observed or not. If they are observed, they become a point physical particle. If they are not observed, they stay being a statistical wave function. Now, this is of profound significance because it effectively means the act of measurement brings about physical reality. There is no argument about this. The only question is how we define an act of measurement. Do we define an act of measurement as being the subatomic particles just interface with other elements within the overall environment? Or is it more precise than this? Is it the fact that the measurement actually takes place when a scientist observes the results of the measurement device? Now, this is the central principle of Schrodinger's cat experiment. It's a profoundly important experiment. But we now know from the research being done by a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna, and I was at Innsbruck, he's now at the University of Vienna. He was the guy that was doing the work with things like buckyballs, you know, so large molecules have this same weird, if I'm observed, I'm a particle, and if I'm not observed, I'm a wave. Now, this means that is this the case then that everything we observe is in some way related to us observing it? And are we collectively, as a collective consciousness, collectively creating the external reality around us by a collective act of togetherness almost? So when we use the term consensual reality, I think it's far more pertinent than that, because consensual reality seems to think that we all agree that this is the universe we're seeing. And each of us are collapsing different wave functions, and we overlap. Now, more importantly, and this is something I've been thinking about recently, is a guy called John Kramer, who's a quantum physicist, has something he calls the transactional interpretation of quantum physics. And this is fascinating. Kramer argues that there are two forms of wave function. There's the wave function that is retarded waves and advanced waves. Retarded waves, no, I think it's advanced waves, are waves that are going into the future from the past. So it's the way we perceive things. You know, we move from the future, comes to us and becomes the past. And we're doing so That's how a retarded wave works. But there are advanced waves that are particles that are going backwards in time. So imagine an idea that what is the present moment? The present moment is the wave function, or the interference pattern of particles going backwards in time and particles going forwards in time, and they interface at this point, which is this moment. And they create an interference pattern. Now, what are interference patterns? They're holograms. This is how holograms work. Now, could it be, and this is, as far as I know, I'm the only person on the planet that's made these links. I don't know. And probably people will say, yeah, because you're mad, or you've misunderstood the quantum physics. But just for a second, imagine the scenario that our active observation in this moment with these two types of waves collapses the wave function into a subatomic particle from those two waves, and all those subatomic particles come together to create this holographic reality that we're now perceiving. Now, people will argue, okay, well, if that is the case, how is it that we can observe things like quasars that existed billions of years ago, way before consciousness evolved? John Wheeler came up with a fascinating example of how that can be the case, and it's called gravity. He brought about a cosmic version of the twin slit experiment, and he used something called gravitational lensing. And this is whereby subatomic particles from a quasar, when they come past a large object such as a galaxy, effectively the photons are split by the gravitational force of the galaxy. And what you see when light from a distant quasar goes past, you see something called an Einstein cross. And an Einstein cross is effectively 4 quasars, but it's only one, and it's in a cross shape. Now, what he said was, imagine then that you could do a twin slit experiment on Earth based upon the light coming from that quasar. Your active observation here will collapse the wave function of light that existed and showing you something that existed 7 or 8 billion years ago. But your active observation now collapses the wave function of that. Now, again, if anybody wants to check up on this, just look it up. It's called John Wheeler gravitational lensing. It's only a thought experiment, but it is very, very intriguing. Now, I'd argue, and the thing I'm really fascinated now, as you know from my new book, is the role of egregores. It seems that under certain circumstances, we can create, by our act of will, realities and entities that are both independent of us and created by our will. Now, I argue things like tulpas. Now, I know that in magic traditions, this has been a standard thing that magicians have been doing from Aleister Crowley and way back in time. John Dee was doing it when he was creating the Enochian angels that he was bringing forth when he was working with Edmund Kelly. And it seems that we can do this. We can create these things. And I'm working at the moment with 2 associates of mine to try and recreate, to see if we can create an egregore that can be then picked up by a group of mediums elsewhere. We're trying to recreate the famous Philip experiment that took place in Toronto in 1972, but we're updating it. And we're trying to set out the controls of how we're going to do this experiment at the moment. But it does seem, and is this a more sophisticated version of, the intention experiment of Lynn McTaggart? Is it a more sophisticated, more scientifically based idea of the law of attraction? That we create collectively this reality around us. And is this why certain people who have certain beliefs, everything they observe in their world reinforces those beliefs? It's as if their world works differently to the world of people who do not believe in those things. Now, we know from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language in many ways molds the way we perceive reality, or at least molds the way we think about reality. But I think it's more ornate than that, because, it's been argued for years now that at its base level, physical reality is basically just information. It's digital information. And it is us. We are digital information processors. Our brains have evolved to be digital information processors that are processing the information and the signals coming up maybe from the 0 point field, which is then extrapolated out into external reality in exactly the same way that this computer and your computer and my computer now is taking electrical signals and creating an image of you and I on our screens in exactly the same way. And I think that's the mechanism, how the interface between digital reality and us works. Now, the final point I'll make on this is that on this, I'm taking the ideas of two incredible thinkers, David Bohm, Professor David Bohm, who argued something called the implicate and explicate orders. And Bohm argued that reality is nested within itself, that it is digital, it is holographic in its nature, and the parts contain the whole, and the whole contains the parts. In one of my books earlier, I said it's an example of the Andromeda galaxies in the tear in your eye. Okay, but there's another guy called Karl Pribram who was at Georgetown University, and Karl Pribram is less known than David Bohm, but his work was intriguing. But he was working on the assumption that the brain works holographically, that the brain itself is a holographic processor. And when Karl Pribram's son read David Bohm's book, The Wholeness and the Implicate Order, I think it was called, he immediately spoke to his father and said, do you know, there's this American guy in London who's coming up with the cosmic ideas that you're doing from the macrocosmic, from the microcosmic. And bringing the two together, if you bring Bohm and Pribram together, you suddenly have this completely different world that is made up of a hologram processing a hologram. And this, to me, is mind-blowing. I touched upon it in my first book, Is There Life After Death? But I'm now taking it on a whole different level.
Fantastic, yeah. And I'm really curious as to what the genesis of the last book was, because it definitely is a stepping off from some of the things that you covered in Opening the Doors of Perception. And I'm really curious to know how how the process of actually drawing together the ideas for the Hidden Universe came about.
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I have, and have anybody seen my recent postings on Facebook? My world is becoming more and more bizarre. My world is becoming so full of synchronicities. It's getting beyond a joke. It's just going crazy now. But I have argued that all through my life, I have been guided by my higher self, my daemon, to do what I'm doing now. Now, I could have come up with a lot of these ideas earlier on in my life, but the time wouldn't have been right, because the social milieu that we exist within now, we know about virtual reality. Many of us have virtual reality headsets. We know how we can be fooled into thinking that there's a three-dimensional reality around us, which is created by our senses. And now suddenly the models I'm coming up with suddenly seem to make more sense. Now, the ideas themselves, I seem to be led to them. I know it sounds weird, and I know it sounds peculiar, but I just follow my nose. I will come across an academic paper and something in my head will say, follow up with that reference there. And I'll follow up with that reference there. And then I'll follow up again, because this is what happened with my first book, Is There Life After Death? Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. I've used the analogy in the past that I wasn't writing that book. I wasn't researching it. I was excavating it. I was like Schliemann at the Hill of Hisaluk in Troy, where I had an idea that there was something here, and I just started digging, which is exactly what Schliemann did. He just started digging, and he found the different levels of Troy. And I found this is what happened. When I started writing It Lad, I had no idea where I was going to go with this. And in all my other books, it's always been the same. I have a kind of basic idea, but I don't know where I'm going to go. And always at the end, I go, Jesus, that's not where I intended to go at all. You know, I didn't expect in the first book to be writing about near-death experiences. That's not what my plan was. I was trying to understand what déjà vu was. You know, and again, with the latest book, in many ways, a lot of that was written in almost a kind of trance state. You know, it just spilled out of me. And every time I looked, the information was there. The circumstances of my mother with her experience with the grey that I describe in the book. I didn't plan that. That happened while I was doing the research. You know, these things come to me and then I follow my nose and I suddenly will find something else. You know, some of the areas I found in terms of the entities themselves, some of the discoveries, the caves. And now, breaking news, even today, it's kicking off for my new ideas and my new book. I'm really intrigued by an American documentary series called Hellier, which my friend Samantha Treasure tipped me off about a week ago. And she said, I'm watching this over in Canada. You must watch it. But I'd started to watch it, but I didn't think much more of it. I've been watching it today, and it's like it's hitting me like hugely. The synergy from what these guys were doing, the investigations these guys did, it's as if they had read the hidden universe and had decided, let's go off and find evidence for it, because they go down the same routes. They find things, they find discoveries. But on top of that, they're instigated by the writings of people like John Keel. Now, John Keel has been a major influence on my life since 1969 and 1970, when I read books like Project Trojan Horse. John Keel then talks about Mothman. He talks about a lot of interesting things. That's what they do. They follow the ideas of John Keel. But on top of that, the bizarre scenarios were just so strange. Like, I'll tell people now, go onto my Facebook site, and Luke, you do this now. Go onto my Facebook site and see the posting I did the day before yesterday. And what I'm doing is I'm discussing the clues that my daemon leading me to writing the book It Lad. And in the introduction to the daemon, I have a section called Footprints in the Snow. And in that, in the video I put up, I discuss how my earlier self had given me clues to its existence to do with mitochondria and mitochondrial DNA, but the thing explains it on Facebook. I did this video explaining it. I showed the book and I showed the dog-eared page which referenced the mitochondria. And I referenced, and I 2 or 3 times said Footprints in the Snow, because that's the heading of the chapter.
Yeah.
Then somebody messages me on Facebook, literally this morning, and he says, you're not going to believe this. A friend of mine was reading your book, The Labyrinth of Time, the audio book, the Audible book, and he's traveling, walking down a road in Kent. He's walking down this road in Kent, and I start to cite an example of a time slip that happened with a friend of mine, Richard Fleming. Okay? And in the time slip, Richard Fleming had a time slip between the village of, is it Plimsoll or something like that, or Plimsoll, somewhere in Kent. And him and his mate were going to a pub. They'd left a farm that they were working on. They got in the car. They drove down 10 minutes down the road, got to the pub, had a pint in the pub, and they had 2 hours missing. They both didn't know where they'd been for that 2 hours. The guy's listening to this as he's jogging, and he's jogging down the road outside that village. And this guy messages me and says, you're not going to believe this synchronicity that's just happened. Then he picks up on the footprints on the snow thing. Then I switch on my computer to go back to the section in this TV series that I last switched off. And I was about 13 minutes in. I switch it on, and there is they're reading an email. And the character that wrote the email points out that these entities that had been plaguing them in their house, it's based upon the old thing about the Hopkinsville goblins and things. But this is updated. This was only a few years ago. And the guy in his email, and they read it out, and the guy says, there were tracks in the snow. And I go, what? And I went back and I said, and I listened to it again. Tracks in the snow, footprints in the snow. It was just uncanny. Now, you could say that this is purely attention bias. You know, you can argue it's attention bias, but that is rooted in levels. And people are now coming back with me about coincidence. Our mutual friend, Martin Ash, the writer, he's messaged me this morning. He's got synchronicities kicking off that's disturbing the hell out of him at the moment. He's messaging me. He's messaged me twice already and saying the synchronicities here are just getting beyond reason. And that synchronicity came from some things you and him were discussing on Facebook. Literally, he referenced, I think, some film or movie or something, Life of Pi. He references the Life of Pi, and he's had this most alarming synchronicity based upon that. This is wheels within wheels. This is beyond comprehension. This is beyond my understanding of exactly what's going on at the moment. But watch Helia, just watch it. And there's a whole section I've just posted on them discussing synchronicity in exactly the same way as I'm doing it.
Oh, fantastic. Well, it was something I was thinking as you were talking about the ideas of, you know, that we create our own reality and this sort of thing. From my own experience, you know, it's that I think I might have even brought this up the last time that we met in London, which is that my experience is that sometimes reality, it kind of, if you take the step towards a worldview, you take a step into that worldview, reality will often will meet you kind of halfway. So, you know, this whole thing, there's a really sort of coarse new age way of putting it, is like you create everything that happens in your life. Obviously we
don't do that. No.
But at the same time, and there's a book called The Long Descent by a writer called John Michael Greer, in which he talks about the idea of the law of attraction and this sort of thing. Is that the origin of these sorts of ideas came out of a very old esoteric tradition, which is that if you live as though you are creating everything that you experience, then the cognitive dissonance of that can open up a whole field of possibilities. So it's not quite that literally, you know, this kind of sort of Abraham Hicks kind of thing.
Yeah.
Very sort of it can be a little bit simplistic, I think. But then there is something there, and everything that you're talking about is this sort of, the reality is kind of, you're taking a step, you know, you read an article and you go, oh, that's interesting, I'll follow up on that, I don't know why, and then reality kind of goes, here you go, and sort of throws little breadcrumbs on.
Yeah. We're using the term at the moment, myself and my associates, it's the labyrinth.
Yeah.
We're working our way through a labyrinth, and it's labyrinthine. Now, you will love this. I want to take the opportunity to do this now because the first time I've ever done it on an interview, particularly because it's you. But I want to take the section from your great-grandfather's book, Man and Time, because I want to show something, because this is extraordinary. Okay, my battered copy of Man and Time, which is clearly it's back to front, so you won't probably be able to read it. But anyway, this is simply the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened in my life. And it is to do with something that occurred way back in 2000. And if you just page 91, and if you've never seen this before, this is extraordinary. Okay, so these pages here. Okay, now I'll explain how strange this is. Way back in 2000, I needed to get hold of a copy of Man and Time, but I didn't have one. I was living in Horsham at the time. So I went down to Horsham Library, and they said, we don't have a copy, and there's no copies of these books anywhere in West Sussex. You're going to have to order a copy from the British Library of Boston Spa, but we'll fill in a form for you. You can fill it in, and you can deal with it. So I said, yeah, okay, fine. And this is all to do, again, with me being guided to write it, lad. This is a crucial point of this. So they send them stuff off, and 2 or 3 weeks go by. And then one day I get a phone call and they say, your copy of Man and Time has now turned up. Would you want to come and pick it up? I couldn't pick it up that day. I went the following Saturday, and I pick the book up and I bring it back home, and I left the book in my study 2 or 3 days. And then one evening I'm going to bed and I just see it in the library and I think, I'll pick that up and I'll have a look at it. Now I pick it up, and as you can see, there are 318 pages in this. I flick through it, and this page 91, opens almost at random. And I start to read it. And this is what your great-grandfather wrote, okay? He's trying to explain how time is relative. So if you see a star, it's as it used to be. And he said, this second form of the basic idea is the easier to understand. For if a ray of light takes time to reach our eyes, it will take no longer to reach them than it'll take longer to reach them the farther we are away from it. So two people are a large distance apart could justifiably disagree about the date of an event. This is clearly illustrated by a figure and an explanation based on it by James A. Coleman in his Relativity for the Layman. Okay, so your great-grandfather chooses a book that was written, it was written in 1964. The Relativity for the Layman by Coleman, I think, was written in 1957. So he could have picked any books on relativity. He chose that one. Okay, that's the first thing. He then quotes Coleman. And Coleman says, this figure shows the Earth, the star Betelgeuse in the constellation Orion the Hunter, and Aldebaran in Taurus, the bull. Betelgeuse and Aldebaran are 352 light years apart, respectively, from the Earth. Also, Aldebaran is about 200 light years from Betelgeuse, or Betelgeuse. Now, suppose there is a blowout on Orion on the night of March the 17th, 2000, caused by Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse exploding. This date and all the dates mentioned here refer to our method of keeping track on time on Earth. And he then goes back and he reiterates the March the 17th, 2000. I'm sitting in bed and I turn around to my wife and I said, what year is it? And she said, it's 2000. And I said, what month is it? And she goes, Penny, she goes, you know what month it is? It's March. And I said, yeah. What day is it? She said, it's the 17th. I said, what time of day is it? She said, it's the evening. And I said, so here I am reading a book published in 1964 that I could have picked up on random at any day in the last 2 weeks. The library could have delayed it. They could have phoned me on a different day. I could have gone in on a different day. It then was sitting downstairs for a week. I picked it up today. This evening, I pick it up. I take it upstairs. Of the 300 and odd pages of the book, I open it at that page to read the date and the time that I am now from a book written in 1957. And my brain just went to jelly. At that point, anybody who turns around to me and says, that is coincidence, that was not coincidence. That then led me to being fascinated by J.B. Priestley. And you all know the background to that was how we met. Or well, we met and then found out subsequently about your relationship with the great man. Subsequent to then, I've written a book on J.B. Priestley. I've referenced his work regularly, and I've now a member of the J.B. Priestley Society. All because of that. But the elements of that book then introduced me to so many other areas and so many other ideas, which then seeded much of my future work. That is how strange. And that was my daemon. That was my higher self, the person that left the footprints in the snow, was the person that made me look at that page to go, ha ha, this is what I can do because I know that you've lived this life before and I deliberately got you to that point just to give you a clue that I exist. I'm leaving you footprints in the snow.
Well, fantastic. Speaking of synchronicity and contact with the daemon, I've been for a few years now. I've been experimenting with the I Ching, and I found it to be I think it was Jung who said that the I Ching is a kind of a technology to induce synchronicity. And I think Marie-Louise von France went further than that and said it is a direct line of communication to the self archetype, which for me, my reading of your work and Jung's work, the self, it seems very much related to the daemon.
Yes. Yeah, the Jungian, the idea of it's very Jungian, extremely Jungian. And I think what I'm doing is literally, I'm just vaguely updating Jung with new terminology, but Jung was powerfully prescient in so many ways.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, I would be fascinated to hear if you've had any experiments with the I Ching.
Very much so. There's a friend of mine that you've met, Bob Steen, American guy. And when we were at university, Bob was fascinated by the I Ching, and we used to use it regularly. And it was uncanny how powerful it was. And of course, you know, a mutual writer that we both admire, Philip K. Dick, you know, The Man in the High Castle, the basis of an awful lot of Philip K. Dick's writing, and as you know, I've written a book on Philip K. Dick, was based on the I Ching. Now, again, I find it guides you. It sort of brings about this mental state whereby you can attune into the deeper level of reality, which I think you're quite right. It seems to guide you. I mean, I've got my copy of the I Ching over there. And we used to use even to the yarrow stalks. You know, we would actually play with the yarrow stalks to actually get the hexagrams correct. So we took it extremely seriously. And there were regular occasions when you're looking for guidance and it tells you what you need. It points you in your way. And I think that's what I need to do. I need to have an I Ching session this afternoon because with coins or something, because I need guidance at the moment, because my life is just so many paths opening at the moment that I'm at a loss to know which way to go, really. I need to reread Paul Casey's Garden of the Forking Paths, I think, just to see if I can pick up any clues there.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Recent example of that I Ching kind of synchronicity is I had my last 2 wisdom teeth removed a few months back, just before the lockdown, and I took a reading before that, and I got the hexagram biting through, which is sort of jaws biting down. It's like there's a sense of humor to it as well. I think that
yeah, that's lovely. That is so good. I like that.
You know, synchronicities in the daemon, there's a humor I find often. There's a certain kind of sly wink that your daemon gives as it kind of drops things on you.
I love it. I came up with one only a couple of days ago. I don't know if I've got it here. Yes, I have. And it was my daemon again playing games with me. We were watching Gardener's World on Friday. I mean, it's sad watching Gardener's World, but we were. And they were talking about the chain of how insects come into a garden, and they're the bottom of the food chain. It means other things eat them, and they all survive, and it all works out well ecologically. And in the particular piece of filming they were doing, there was a cat in the garden, and off the top of my head, for no apparent reason, I turned around to Penny and I said, I wonder what feeds on cats. Are they the top of the chain? And then a little voice in my head said, no, they're the caterpillars. And I go, I didn't come up with that. I did not come up with that. I was led to make that pun to amuse myself because I didn't make it. Because you couldn't, because there was the whole lead up to it and the circumstances, you know. And that happens so often. And as you say, it's the cosmic joker. It's the one going, ho, ho. And then you wait, don't you, for the next installment where there will be a rooted coincidence that will be within that. It's like Camera, I think, was the guy that first came up with the concept of rooted coincidences, the Austrian statistician. And he said the things about synchronicities, they are rooted and they are related. They revert back to themselves, almost like a hologram. You know, they root within themselves, and there are so many channels you can follow. It's not a coincidence; it's a game.
Yeah.
And it's almost the way the game is telling you this is a game. You don't need to worry about it because we're not really playing with you maliciously, but there is a game here, and you're in it in one way or another.
Thanks so much for your time. And just before we go, do you want to maybe point anyone watching to your website and where we can find more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. My website is anthonypeake.com. That's Anthony with an H, Peake, as in Mervyn.com. And I update that regularly. On there, you will find all my interviews with individuals such as yourself in terms of Consciousness Hour. If you're interested in buying my books, you just can go down to your local bookshop and order them if the bookshops are open. You can also get them on Amazon. You can also buy them off my website if you wish, if you want signed copies. 3 of my books are now in Audible. All my books are in Kindle. My books are now I have at least 1 book in every major European language and a couple of minor European languages if anybody's interested in reading in foreign languages. 2 of my books will be coming out in Greek later this year, which is really exciting because I'm going to be doing some very exciting work in Greece. If you want to link up with me on Facebook, just look up Anthony Peake. I also own Anthony Peake Author and Anthony Peake Writer, which I also update on a regular basis. But Anthony Peake, the Facebook site, is my regular interface, and I update at least 2 or 3 times a day on there. I'm also very active on Instagram. If you want to check me on Instagram, I'm Cheat the Ferryman 54. Again, I post lots of things on there. Come in and join us. You and I, we're part of a much bigger group here, and you and I know that it's really exciting, the things we get involved in. So yeah, thanks very much, Luke, and hopefully we will catch up again soon with the second edition of this.